सर्वकारेषु सर्वदा सरस्वती नमस्तुभ्यं वरदे कामरूपिणी विद्यारम्भं करिष्यामि सिद्धिर्भवतु मे सदा ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात् गुरुब्रह्मा गुरुविष्णु गुरुदेवो महेश्वरः गुरुदेवः परब्रह्म तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः ॐ सहना भवतु सहनो भुनक्तु सह वीर्यं करवावहै तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्ति.
Okay, so welcome everybody. We only have so much time, and so trying to maximize it and make it the most meaningful in that sense. The chapter 1 of the Bhagavad Gita, is probably the least favorite chapter of the book because it is a transitional chapter from the larger Mahabharata story into the Bhagavad Gita. So I remember the first time I read it, I was like, my eyes were kind of rolling back in boredom when they were listing off all the various kings and princes and all of that kind of stuff. And most of which is not super significant unless you're really into it and you need to know more or want to know more. So does everyone know the story already? Do we need to kind of go do a quick overview of that? Do we want to talk about that? Do we just want to dive right into the actual chapter itself? Because we got kind of a mixed group, right? So, different people may have more or less knowing of the backstory of the context.
I know a brief overview.
Okay, all right, sounds good. And those of you who know the story, by all means, jump in. Like I say, this is not meant to be a discourse and a lecture, okay? So basically, the Mahabharata is the larger story. It's the oldest epic, basically, around. If you combine the Iliad and the Odyssey together, it's like 6 or 8 times longer than both of those, so it's a really big story. But so I'm cutting a lot in the very brief overview. Basically, what it boils down to is that there are 2 sets of cousins, the Kauravas and the Pandavas, 2 families who are at odds as to who are the rightful heirs of the kingdom. So the Kaurava cousins are sort of the bad guys in the exoteric sort of sense of the story, where their father is the elder brother. So like if you think about William and Harry, William's going to be the king, but there's no Meghan Markle, right? I make bad jokes sometimes. But he's blind. So his younger brother Pandu, so hence the name Pandava for his sons, becomes the king in a sense. So the blind king, Dhritarashtra is his name, the cousins all kind of grow up in the kingdom and there's always this competition between them, okay? As they get older, the Kaurava cousins, there's 100 of them versus 5 of the Pandava cousins, okay? As they are growing up, they're always competing with each other and who's really going to be the heir. So the eldest of the Kauravas, his name is Duryodhana. Duri means evil, so dur, the root of that in Sanskrit is evil. So almost all the brothers have this duh or dur, something like conveying their kind of more the evil side. And so basically there's a whole series of things that they do to each other to try to, they try to burn alive and they try to do all this terrible stuff to the Pandavas, the better cousins. Ultimately, what happens is they trick the eldest brother, who would be the rightful heir to the kingdom. Yudhishthira is his name. Even though he's the son of righteousness, of Dharma, the god Dharma, he has a weakness for gambling. And so they trick him into sort of this loaded game of dice. And ultimately, again, there's a lot of complexity in the story. Ultimately, he loses everything, their freedom, their kingdoms, everything, and they get exiled to the forest. And when their time of exile is finished, then they are coming back to the kingdom to get their half of the kingdom basically back. And unsurprisingly, Duryodhana doesn't want to give it back. They're like, we're not even going to give you one hut with 5 bedrooms. Like, you get nothing, kind of thing. And so that really then sets the stage where now, in a certain sense, they have no choice but to go essentially to war to get what's righteously theirs. Okay? And so then what happens is there's this polarity of the family because it's a fratricidal war now, and who's going to fight on whose side, right? And then that becomes sort of significant in that way. So 2 of the elders who are mentioned in the chapter, and we'll highlight them, one is Bhishma, who's sort of their like a great-grand uncle kind of thing, and he's a celibate, and he's kind of the mentor for all of them. And then he becomes the leader of the Kaurava, the bad guy army, even though he's good. And it's sort of an example, like if you look at it more interpretatively, it's sort of blind duty and blind obedience. You know, he feels obligated to the kingdom, basically, even though he knows he's fighting on the wrong side of the war, so to speak. And then their other teacher that taught them sort of martial arts and, you know, how to fight and archery and all that stuff, his name is Drona, or Drona Acharya, and he too is fighting on the sort of the bad guy's side. In contrast, both of them, they're Krishna is their cousin, basically. Through marriage, it's their cousin. And so Krishna sort of tries to stay out of the war, right? Because he's above all this stuff, so to speak. So he's sleeping one day. Hi, welcome. And both Arjuna and Duryodhana want him to fight on their side, or they want his support, because he has his own kingdom and his own armies and all this stuff. They don't really know he is how we think of Krishna now, but they know there's something different about him. So he's taking a nap. Duryodhana, the eldest cousin, so to speak, goes and sits at his head and waits for him to wake up. Arjuna comes and sits at his feet, which is very symbolic, right, in terms of more surrender and humility kind of thing. And Krishna, playing the games that Krishna always likes to do, wakes up, looks down towards his feet, and goes, "Oh, hey, Arjuna," and, you know, "What can I do for you?" kind of thing. And Duryodhana is like, "Well, wait a minute, buddy, I was here first." And Krishna's like, "Oh, you're here too," kind of playing, right? And so each of them then sort of petition Krishna to join their relative side. And so Krishna gives them sort of the choice. You can have my entire army who will fight in full force for your side, or you can have me alone, unarmed, and I'll just drive your chariot, and that's it. What do you choose? And so he gives Arjuna the first choice, and Arjuna chooses him. Duryodhana's thrilled because he wanted the armies, right? And so that's how Krishna then becomes Arjuna's charioteer into the story, basically. And so then what that does is then that leads us then where now the 2 armies are getting ready on the battlefield, the Kurukshetra battlefield, which is mentioned in the beginning. The blind king can't see the battle, so they're somewhere nearby, and his sort of advisor, Sanjaya, who is, you'll see speaking in the first chapter, he's given by the author of the book, Veda Vyasa, who's like the sage that compiled the Vedas and wrote the Mahabharata, gives him divine vision, basically, so he can kind of like telepathic vision to see and hear what's going on the battlefield. And so now they're nearby and they're getting ready, and that's how we open the chapter, basically, is he's now asking, so the very first, and that's how we open the chapter, basically, is he's now asking, so the very first line of it is Dhritarashtra, the blind king, asking Sanjaya, "Hey, what are my people doing, right? Sanjaya, tell me what happened at Kurukshetra, the field of Dharma, where my family and the Pandavas are ready to fight, right?" And so that's our setup, basically, in a nutshell. How'd I do? Did I sum it up?
I would just add that the position of charioteer is an advice giver, so that was like also a really interesting position.
Yeah. And so, well, so when we're talking about that, one thing I guess since we're on it, and one of the things with the, the Bhagavad Gita is in many ways, they call it kind of like the fifth Veda, you know what I mean, in the sense of what it's really doing is it's summarizing in more accessible terms, more or less, the essence of the Upanishads, which is the end of the Vedas or the Vedanta, basically. And so there's a lot of stuff that are almost lifted, almost word for word out of the Upanishads. But I printed this out, and if you guys can take one each. So it's not an accident, I think, in many ways that, so in the Katha Upanishad, there's a little boy named Nachiketas who goes and has a dialogue with death. And he's asking all these questions back and forth. And within the Katha Upanishad, death basically gives the analogy. And so it's a good way to understand sort of the Vedic way of thinking of sort of the structure of the body in a certain sense, where the horses of the chariot are symbolic of the senses. The roads that they go out towards are going to be, each of the senses are basically drawn like moths to a flame to their input, right? That's what they do, right? So the horses are the senses going to the various sensory outputs into the world. The reins on the horses is the mind, right? The mind is sort of the controlling or the sort of the synthesis ground of the sensory input. And then the charioteer is the intellect, basically trying to rein in the mind and steer the senses in the mind. And then the passenger in the chariot is the soul, basically, in that model. And so that's sort of a rough conception of kind of how things are built. Now, of course, in the Gita, Krishna is the charioteer, so it's not 100% parallel in that way, but I don't think it's any accident that, symbolically there's some of that was sort of overlapping in that sense. Any comments? Nothing? Okay, so I guess then the question is, so hopefully you guys read it. So a lot of the first chapter in many ways, if you look at it at a very superficial level, there's not much to it that's really of interest to us modern-wise. In fact, Adi Shankaracharya, who is like sort of the biggest guru or teacher of Vedanta from the past, didn't even start his commentary until the second chapter, because he just sort of skipped it, But I think, so the question becomes, what's the inner significance for us? Because again, if you get lost in the names and the forms, it's kind of meaningless, right? But for those of you who've read it, any thoughts on the inner significance of, let's say, Arjuna? Because what's happening here, right? Arjuna is there, and he's looking at he's going to be surveying this battlefield. What do we think is the significance, and how do we relate that to us now? Anyone want
It's inner
talk?
conflict.
You don't want to hear me talk the whole time, so by all means.
It's inner conflict. It's
Right.
him being at war of, this is my family, this is part of me. And so it's, what is it? The way I kind of read it and like the feeling of it, the closest feeling I get when like reading through all the names, I don't really know too much of the significance, but it felt like, you've seen Avengers Endgame and like everybody's at like the battlefront waiting. Like that to me is the vibe of like, it's all about to go down, it's all here, it's coming to fruition, and there are people on the other side, or like I guess Civil War because I like Marvel. But that to me was like the same essence, except also with that added layer of, but it's all me. And seeing all of those different parts that built up me, like
Right.
the different teachers, the different mentors, and all of that. And yeah, that to me is how so I read this in order to put it into context of how I would be if I was Arjuna in that, what feeling would I be doing? It'd be an inner conflict of, this is all me.
Right.
I'm told to go to war with me.
Right. Exactly, right? Because if you think about it, he's seeing his cousins, he's seeing his teachers, his mentors, right? And he knows that he's now tasked with killing them, right? And so if we think about that, and if we're on, if we're on this journey, you start looking within, you start doing inner work, right? You start to recognize suddenly that you're not all that awesome, right? You think you're awesome until you start looking within, and then you start to realize, like, oh, maybe I'm a little, as you become more sensitive to your own faults and failures, and you start to see some of your inner demons and whatever, and you realize that you have to give those up, but those are also part of your ego, right? And so now we have to kill our own ego in order to transcend it, right? But the ego doesn't want to kill the ego, right? And so therein is the conflict. It's, again, a lot of times you can almost think of it as the little angel and the little devil on our shoulders, right? Like in the old cartoons. And so we have that hesitation. So the question becomes, one of the things that some of the different commentators were asking about or commenting on is Arjuna, is it weakness and cowardice on his part? Is it ego on his part? Or is it that he's a wise man and he's actually seeing things through a higher vision? Because I'll tell you, there's commentators that have all three of those interpretations. When you read different sort of versions of the Gita, right? So what do you guys think? Like, is it weakness? Is it his own sense of ego and pride? Or is it that he's just really, really wise?
Well, to me, it's confusion, or what to do at any particular instant. What do we let our senses take over, or do we let a little, think about what is the right thing to do and what's the wrong? That is always, that's the inner conflict that Arjuna is representing. Because in one way, yes, he has to fight the war. He decided to be the general and to fight for not only his family and all that, but for the right, so to speak, because Duryodhana was creating so much havoc everywhere. And if so-called evil people take over the kingdom, then that is going to be the rule of law, the way of life in the whole kingdom. But hopefully, if the right people take over. But then there are his cousins, there are his uncle, and granduncle, and his guru, and everybody is there. So, obviously he's confused.
Yeah, he was basically being very forgiving. Like there were many things that had happened to him and to his family, to his wife, that God once did. But he was willing to let go of everything, just forget it, and not go to war. So,
do you think he was sincere in that, or do you think that was a cop-out because he was having doubts?
and he didn't want to kill his. I think he was more inclined of not killing his, his uncle, his sister, his teacher, and his brothers. And because of that, he was willing to forgive everything. He just didn't want to go to war.
Okay. So here's an interesting question that was brought up, as we were doing this. For those of you who are familiar again with the story, there's the 5 Pandava brothers. Arjuna is the middle brother, basically. So the eldest Yudhishthira is the son of Dharma, the god of Dharma, right? Righteousness, so to speak, right? Bhim is sort of kind of a hothead, to use a Marvel thing, maybe not the best way. He's sort of the Incredible Hulk, right? He just, beam smash kind of thing. Then you have Arjuna, who's sort of a skilled archer. And then you have Nakula and Sahadev, who are sort of intelligence and wisdom and beauty and all of this. So the question is that I thought was interesting. I never really thought of this until kind of going through this. Why was Arjuna chosen by Krishna? Why didn't Krishna choose Yudhishthira as the leader? Why did Krishna not give the Bhagavad Gita to Yudhishthira, who's the son of Dharma? You would think, right, he's the eldest, he is already the most inferior dharmic, right? Yet it's Arjuna that he gives the Gita to, and not the others.
I would think, I've never thought of it that way, but that's true. I would think of it because Arjuna is action. So basically it's karma yoga. When you're, every minute of your life you're doing something. So then we have to decide on what should we do, what is the right thing to do, and I guess I'm paraphrasing whatever they're saying that it is so it's about what should we do and why we should do it. Should we do it for our own selfish interest, or should we put ourselves aside and do it selflessly? And is it for others, or is it for God? So it comes up, right? Karma yoga and dharma yoga, and also bhakti yoga. You're doing it for God and you're doing it for yourself. So,
Yeah.
Also, I think the work of literature is more interesting. Encouraging the folk of the story. I think he's more human, he's more relatable, and I think the conflict he experiences is symbolic and universal for any conflict, any conflict dimension. And so his, like, the fact that he has to make a decision, I think is symbolic of a decision anywhere. You ultimately have to choose one side. That means letting go, or when a decision comes, like cutting off another side.
Right.
And he's the person who really needs the wisdom in this time.
Right. So do you think then the eldest, so does Duryodhana, do the bad guys have, he has some fear, you can see in the first few things. The opening is he's surveying the opposing army, and his bravado is starting to get a little bit, he's starting to have doubts, right? He's kind of like, let's review our army, and he's sort of trying to butter up his teacher, and this is where Bhishma, the grandsire of the family, sort of, in order to kind of get him, he's starting to waver a little bit, and he sort of, as they say, roars like a lion and blows his conch, which is really the official sort of beginning of the war, right? It's the, all right, we're ready to go. So Duryodhana is sort of having some doubts of sorts, right? But not in the sense of Arjuna, right? He's more just like, holy moly, like this is we're gonna go now, right? This is kind of getting a little scary. Do you think Yudhishthira or Bhima or Nakula or Sahadeva were having doubts?
I think their dharma was each different, because Arjuna was like the archer, like amazing archer, and so he was the warrior, and that was his dharma, to be fighting, to be a general, to do that. Whereas like Yudhishthira was like the leader, and so because it's different in that was versus like Duryodhana and all of that, they had different dharma as well. They were trying to do what they thought was right, so everyone was kind of like doing what's right versus all of the setbacks and kind of like their senses telling them kinship. I don't know, like telling kin is weird and uncomfortable, or losing, the outcome of that, and being attached to the outcome versus doing what's right.
And something also, the fact, like, if you see, Krishna and Arjuna have been very close, like since the beginning, and Krishna's sister is also married to Arjuna.
Right.
So I think they have that bond which Krishna does not share with any other Pandavas, and that might be one of the reasons.
Like how I have understood over the period of time, it's like whenever the childhood of these five brothers have been displayed. So like Yudhishthira has always been on the righteousness. So regardless of what the situation with the person, this is right, this is wrong. If this is wrong, this is wrong. That's how his character has been portrayed. With Bhima, as you said, Incredible Hulk, right? If in anger, I'm gonna smash everything until I'm stopped. And for Nakul and Sahdev, I think they have been portrayed more of like obedient younger brothers with their skill sets. But for some reason, and where I think as human we relate with Arjuna a lot, is his whole life journey, or when they were in Gurukul, the whole teaching has been focus oriented. The best of the best character in his has been the focus. From those stories of, when on the way to getting married, the challenge was to poke the eye of the fish, and he was chosen because he was very focused. He learned the skill set. So, that's how he was portrayed, like how us all in our field of profession try to gain as much as skill set and hone it and be very focused in it. So in a way that you got so skilled, you did everything, but when the time of the challenge came, like when the real life actually came when you got out of your school, there you are afraid to improvise your all those skill sets that you're focused on. And that's how I see that's where Krishna was just there as an advisor. Not telling that just go and shoot and blast or anything, but just like advising. So I see Arjuna as one of those that we all do all our life and be very focused and skilled, but in the name like real life and the challenges there, he's having like cold feet actually. He's not inconfident that he cannot do it, but in anecdote, it can be anybody. It can be us versus us kind of situation as well. But in those kind of moments, how do you use your skill set? How do you let go of what you have learned and improvise new things, with all the tiny incidents that happen in the war? So I see it like that he's brilliant at what he has learned, but when it's time for action, probably is having to that's how it is.
In that way, making a small comment on the distinction between skill and confidence and ability and judgment and wisdom. Those two things are not the same.
Right.
It reminds me of, especially since, archery is part of his background. When you are an archer, you have the skill, you have your focus, all of the training is there, but at the end of the day, you have to let go of the arrow. And you have to stop thinking about all of your different skill sets and maybe my trajectory's wrong, maybe I need to do. I think he's literally stuck in that kind of state of over-rationalization, overthinking, literally in the truest sense. And being stuck in the intellect of this chariot model, not really knowing anything. If you are not confident and overthinking of, okay, I can't even do any of it. That I've been in that state before and in many different situations. And I kind of see it as that paralysis state of overthinking, over-rationalization. I'm trying to think about this issue and what is wrong, right, what is right, and you can come up with a billion different perspectives and reasons and rights and wrongs. And at the end of the day, you still have to fight. You still have to live here.
Yeah, I think so. One of the commentaries that I was looking at was the way that they phrased it that I thought was very good was Arjuna represents a bridge of sorts between the two banks of a river. Each of the banks of a river are very solid and very secure. But when you're the bridge, you're less secure. And so on the one side, you have, let's say, the Kaurava brothers, Duryodhana, and those guys, who are very sure in many ways of their sort of mission because they're unthinking, in a sense, about higher things, right? So they're not having the doubts and the reservations in the same way because they're so sure of what they are that they don't have doubt, right? It's like a lot of people in the world, right? They may be doing things that are maybe not necessarily the best, but they don't have the twinge of conscience telling them that they're not doing the right thing, right? They're wholly on that side. And then on the contrast, you have Krishna, so to speak, representing the other bank of the river, where he is wholly confident and doesn't have doubt and wavering in his righteousness, right? So he represents sort of the other riverbank. And then Arjuna, i.e. us, right? We're somewhere in the middle trying to negotiate these two polarities between, our higher and lower urges, our higher, our worldly versus, spiritual sort of pulls and pushes and things like that. And so that's where Arjuna is that transitional character as we are in a certain sense, or not wholly bad, because if you were, well, I don't want to say bad, that's maybe not the right word, wholly not thinking about this stuff, you would be sitting in a Bhagavad Gita study group on a Saturday morning, right? Or if you were wholly on the other side, well, you'd be the Swamiji teaching us, right? Those of us in the middle are the Arjunas, so to speak. So I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about it. So I thought then the question is, do we create more anxiety for ourselves? These things just get hot and beat, don't worry about it. Is it almost better in a way to sort of fully commit? Because a lot of times, right, we're constantly pushed and pulled because we're trying to find all of these loopholes, right? Well, it's inconvenient to eat vegetarian food, or, I don't want to give this up, or whatever it may be, right? So do we actually end up causing more anxiety and more grief for ourselves and keep ourselves kind of perpetually in this middle zone versus sort of taking the leap of faith, so to speak, and just sort of committing to, our higher callings, I guess.
I think if you're going with like the inner battle type metaphor,
Yeah.
What I really liked is verse like 21 to 23, when he's like, show me the armies. So it's almost his first time being like, I want to take an honest look inside at what's actually going on out here. And so what you're saying, like, you want to be stuck in the middle, I feel like this is representative of you're making the choice to even look for the first time. Kind of.
No, I think that's great.
So, kind of like, and I feel like by the end of the chapter, he almost surrenders his ego, like drops down into the battlefield, and is like, okay, I'll just listen, like I need help. And it's like a moment of despondency almost that leads you to some kind of awakening, or at least listening, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
So it's very relatable. I think like a lot of people have that moment. Yeah.
What else? I mean, one of the things, I pick up, one of the things also, if we look at, sort of if we go to, verse 30, kind of around there, where he's having sort of his 29 to 30, he's having his sort of little mini nervous breakdown, right, where he's just absolutely paralyzed with, indecision and fear and, all of these different things, then he's going on and on and on, kind of from 31, just kind of keep going down and down and down. And so he's just spinning, right? And this is, I think, in some ways representative of all of the multiple ways that the mind is going to play tricks on us and find excuses and exploit every weakness and every possible loophole it can find. The ego is going to figure out a way to try to help justify its existence, right? And so you can just hear him and just see him. It's kind of like the storyteller, right? Who every time they tell the story, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. It goes from 5 fish to 10 fish, and then it's a shark. And, it's just as he goes on and on and on, it's just he's just getting more and more and more. So so I think that it's kind of interesting that he's just sort of piling it on that way.
You mentioned like some of the commentaries after this is cowardice, and yes, in a way it is. But I think it's also would be so much less interesting if you didn't have this doubt.
Sure.
And if you didn't go through this process of navigating this, so it's both relatable and universal. And there's a wisdom in even just like having in the conscience, like you mentioned, like question what I'm doing just to make sure you're in the right side. And so like both cowardice and but wisdom.
Do you think if he were on the same battlefield and wasn't fighting against his cousins, he would have had the same doubts? No. He was built to kill. I mean, that's what he does. He's a special ops guy, right? He's a Delta Force
class, yeah.
Yeah, he's a Delta Force guy, and he's having doubts, right? He's done this a gazillion times. The whole Mahabharata is chock full of stories of him just absolutely butchering everybody to get various things, right? So he has no problem killing anybody, right? So it's only because, so typically a lot of the commentators are like, it's his attachment, right? that is driving his doubt. It's his attachment that makes it. It's our attachment to those things that we still think of as part of us that gives us that doubt and that reservation. First, because we still identify it as part of us. We still are identifying with our thoughts. We're identifying with our history. We're identifying with our emotions, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're hesitating to kill them because we think of that as us. Whereas, by the end, right, we no longer ideally identify with any of those things, and we're just now identifying with our highest self, right? And so therefore, then the duty is been brought, right? Because now we're detached, right? Yeah. So then, what do you think about where he's talking about running off into the woods and becoming a renunciate? And is that wisdom in this case? Is that escapism?
No, I think it's fatalism.
Is it fatalism?
Yeah.
Do we do the same thing?
Absolutely.
Can we use spirituality as an excuse to sort of mentally check out of the world, and it becomes a form of escapism? Good, right? So where do we find that balance between sort of pulling back enough and not necessarily being hammered on the day-to-day on our social media feeds with news of bombings and this and that and all the drama and trauma that goes on in the world, but still staying true to our center? Where do we find that balance?
I think
without being
will explain.
Yes. Well, therein is the point of the book.
I think even going back to that text you had mentioned of line 30 specifically, he said, like, within that spiral of his, he drops his bow, and I think that very much shows he is drawing a lot of his strength from the skill set that was discussed earlier, and from that, which shows why Krishna's needed there, to give him that internal wisdom of drawing that from himself rather than bringing his strength from his archery, from his skills, from his violence that he has been there for most of his stories. So I think that brings it there. That balance comes from not just relying on what our accomplishments, what we can do, what we have there, but then also finding that inner peace, which is what Krishna represents throughout.
Kind of like if you establish Krishna in your heart, then you have that wherewithal to withstand all the vagaries of life and get through life and choose the right path, right action.
So I have a question. So why do you think he hesitated this time? This is not the first time he's fighting the Kauravas, right? In the Virat War, he alone fought against all of them, but he did not hesitate. So what's different between the two wars?
That's a good question.
This is the final battle. It's do or die.
I mean, in any war, you're not fighting. You're fighting to defeat or kill the other. So he could have killed. He didn't kill anybody, but he didn't hesitate the last time. But this time, I guess your point is like he has to kill to defeat.
It seems the danger maybe you mentioned this, but I think some of the commentaries did mention that it seemed like almost, and the word of text, I would think that was almost inserted there.
Yeah.
So there is, I think they mentioned there's a bit of a tone shift that can come through it.
That's true. Yeah, and that's the tricky balance between how much do we read at face value, especially for this part of it, right? Where it's not so much the more esoteric philosophy, right? No, but it's a good point. I don't know if I know the answer to that question.
I liked the line where they're talking about how generally when Arjuna is fighting, he's very into like, okay, when I win this battle, I'm going to do it for all my family and all the lands. But in this battle itself, if I'm slaughtering the people that I usually win battles for, what's the point? That kind of brings up the conjuring, and he kind of explores Gita's anxiety spiral from there as well. So I think there were a lot of like interesting parts in there that kind of allude to why this is such a big deal.
Makes sense. Yeah.
So what would you guys say, because I'm also just trying to be mindful of time, what would you guys say then, because again, it's a transitional chapter, so, what would you guys say would be, so, okay, you go home, your significant other asks you, well, what did you guys talk about? Or what's chapter 1 about, right? So some of the questions I was trying to think just to kind of prompt me was, what questions does this, in some chapters these questions relay better than others, and this is admittedly one of the harder chapters to sort of lay some of this out. So what questions does this chapter answer, right? What are some of the more philosophical concepts that are presented within the chapter? Let's maybe start with that. So what does this chapter answer any sort of specific questions? Does it give us definitions? Because again, at the end of the day, why are we reading this book, right? Like, it's about how do we apply this into our life, on our journey. I mean, yes, it's nice to read it as a piece of literature, and it's great, but that's hopefully we can take more out of it. So, are there any sort of questions that you feel like spiritually that like doesn't answer any questions yet, or is it still just asking more questions and setting us up later to get the answers?
I think it's set up in questions for answering.
Anyone else? It's more the set, right? I think. Okay, I think that's fair. And then then again, just sort of, kind of like the summary slide, right? Like, what are those philosophical concepts then that, we think are the take-home philosophical concepts from the chapter that we can kind of carry with us? Chapter 1 is about this in the sense of, and how does that relate to our lives?
I really like the idea that, this is just like a metaphor for just like an internal, like different parts of the self, and just how Arjuna, it's like how he's like really seeing and feeling things rather than jumping right into it. When you're talking about the 3 ways of interpretation, it does feel like, awareness and stuff, versus just like, I'm going to identify and just like commit to this, like, battle. So I think it's, this is my first read through of it. Just as we see how it develops, just how, the different families and representations of the self and letting go of that, while being present with that and how that works out. So I did see some wisdom and just like real like emotional feeling, even though he's doubting and questioning, part of the process. So just how we're present with those hard times and don't just jump into things and identify as one. Step back. Anyone else?
In a way, it's okay to be confused. Like, even though I know Krishna will say later on that it's not okay to be confused in this world, but it's okay to be confused sometimes. And you can always ignite the inner Krishna in you to show you that.
I think Krishna is saying it's okay to be confused, but it's not okay to stay in that confusion.
Yeah.
We all get confused, that makes sense, but you need to pick up the phone. And I think a lot of this chapter was very easy for me because I find myself in that state every day. So I get it. I get Arjuna.
I think we all can, right? If we're actually looking within a little bit, right? Okay. And then, let me just see. And then, so I was just looking at, just, sort of notable quotables, I'll sometimes call it. Were there any sort of particular verses that you thought were a particular sort of noteworthiness or kind of hit you in a particular way that you thought was more relevant? You sit and you listen to a Swami and, they say, in the Gita, Arjuna, they start rattling off, some of the verses, and just, in that sense. Were there any verses that you felt were more noteworthy to you, or you think were more worthy of attention in that sense? And maybe no, but just anything that kind of maybe you highlighted, so to speak. Like, oh, I like this verse. This one kind of is a little more meaningful to me.
I think for me it was the 38-39, where it says, though they are overpowered by greed and see no evil in destroying families or injuring friends, we see these evils, why shouldn't we turn away from this sin? So I'm in constant battle like this. Not that I'm fighting with the sword, but
of course.
So I was like, what's the answer to that? When we are recognizing that what that action the other person is doing is wrong, how should we convince that we need to do the same action? Yeah. That.
Yeah. Yeah, do you take the high road in the face of injustice?
Yeah, like most of the time, like choose peace.
Right.
Think about 5 years from now with this matter and choose peace. You know, that's the approach normally I take. But when I read that, I'm like, oh, am I being a coward? Am I just running away?
I think truthfully, my reading of it, not that it would probably be, if Krishna were here saying it, probably, if it's truly an injustice, probably I would think Krishna would say that we are being cowards if we don't do it.
That makes so much rage in the heart. Like when there's so much injustice, even 1 mile around us, and forget the whole globe. So
Right.
most of the time, it's like shut down. That I'm not looking at it, so I'm not get educated because you start feeling and you feel helpless because yes, every word has power, but again, it's a different dynamic. And it's like, how do you do it? Do you focus on living a peaceful life, or do you focus on being a rebel and fight for it? And I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. I think, it's a balance, right, that we have. Because you can't take on the world, right? And so, I think it's like I posted an Instagram thing where it was a Rumi quote that says, yesterday I was smart, so I wanted to change the world. Today I'm wise, so I'm trying to change myself, right? And so, you can imagine, if our house is in disorder, in that sense, is the effort really better spent fixing our own internal duryodhanas and kauravas, right? And maybe you're not going to take on every battle that's in the earth because you can't, right? Because if everyone did that, right, then actually everything would get better. If everyone would just do that. They won't, but if they did, at least as a thought experiment, right? So I think Swami Chinmayananda, in his commentary, he kind of harps on this, where he says it's active resistance to evil. So it's you don't want to chicken out in that sense. If it's evil and it's an injustice, we should, in a non-violent way, kind of like Gandhi, I guess, in a sense, right?
Take action.
Taking action, but not necessarily meaning evil on evil, right? In that sense. So I think that's I think where Gandhi gave that good example, even though obviously we've had some detractors since then, right? That's a whole different conversation. But so I think in that sense, but that's a very good quote. Do we just let it go? Because it's like your drunk friend who, does something dumb to you while they're drunk. Do you forgive it because they're deluded, or do you hang on to it? That's a hard decision, right? Easier said than done, certainly. Any other sort of specific quotes that, or verses that people liked? Okay. And then, let me see, I'll just write, and then practical applications, quickly, I think we touched on any. Does anyone want to just sort of bullet them so that, the take home, what do we, from a practical perspective, what can we internally, because practical doesn't always necessarily mean external, right? A lot of times when we go to study groups, we like, well, what are the practical applications? Well, this isn't like coding, right, or medicine, where, okay, well, the practical application of stitches, right? It's all about changing our mindset. So what can we take from a practical point from the chapter in terms of what can we bring into, because obviously there's much more to come, naturally, but so far, is there any practical applications of what we can do with this information?
Maybe like dharma versus kama.
Dharma versus kama?
Yeah.
Okay. If some people may not know what
Oh, sorry.
those two
Your duty versus the pursuit of duty versus the pursuit of pleasure, and like thinking about that and what you want to pursue, where you want to go for it.
Anybody else?
Maybe just a recognition that, like, when you're feeling this decision, just really this, like, this chapter can help remind yourself that you're the bigger things clearly, and that it wasn't a decision. Maybe there is one right answer that could be really costly, but like you have to make a decision and kind of having a mindset that, like, it's kind of painful and confusing, but you have to choose one of these options, and there'll be a conflict with feel like there's one tension inside. That's unnatural.
let me ask one quick follow-up question. We may want to run away from this battle, right? Even till now, the question becomes, when you look at the big picture spiritually, can we run away from this battle? Is it even possible? I would argue no. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Can't run away from yourself, right? And if, again, within the context of the philosophy, the underlying, the unspoken current of philosophy in this, if we're looking at that, if there's an a priori assumption that we're talking about reincarnation and then sort of the merging of the soul, ultimately, the journey of the soul to get off of the wheel of reincarnation, birth and death, so to speak, samsara, right? Which is ultimately all of our highest destiny when all is said and done. So then the question becomes, that's an inevitability. So the battle is going to be fought, whether it's fought in this lifetime or in 100 lifetimes from now. We're going to fight this fight, right? In that sense. Does anyone disagree? Disagree if you disagree, please.
It's already happened, it is happening, and it will happen again.
Yeah. That would be my contention. We may not want, and maybe you don't take the fight on in this birth. You bury your head, you go back, you escape to the forest, so to speak, you go back to a purely worldly nature, and you can sort of bury it for a while, and maybe even you die, and again, if we are working under an assumption of reincarnation, you're going to be reborn again and pick up where you left off until you finally decide you want to take on the battle, right? So the question is not if, it's just when, right? And how hungry are you for freedom or not? You know what I mean? So that would be my thought.
There's a little confusion regarding that with me. Like, whenever I have looked around, it's like the reincarnation cycle stops when your accumulation of the bad karma stops. Then you become part of all the big stars. And if you are fighting, so in the same context, sure, like whoever was killed on the Kaurava side, their wives, their mothers, and their relatives must have felt sad, and even the Pandavas had to go for liberation. If you keep fighting battle, how do you make sure of your bad karma and get out of this whole cycle? Is there a way, or we
Well, again, my thought would be kind of what he had alluded to. We have to also be a little careful to take things too concretely, right, in terms of the analogy that we're working with here, right? So, I mean, I think, you know, if you read, you know, and it talks about all this stuff a lot, right? Karma is only relevant while you still believe in the dream. So, from the highest viewpoint, right, from the viewpoint of Brahma, right, or Shiva, if you want to be a tantrika, right, this is all just manifestation, right? So it says in the Mandukya Upanishad, there's a second part, the Karika, right? Gautamada is sort of the grandfather of Advaita. And he says, and it says in that Turiya state, that fourth state beyond the sleep, the waker, and the deep sleeper, right? It's just the aham, I am, right? And that it's no different than a dream. He says it, that this is no different than a dream. So then think about it. If you're in a dream, right, and you murder your husband, right, and you are suffering the consequences of that action, internally the guilt, the anger, the fear, whatever, the external consequences, all of everything that's happened. Whilst you're still in the dream, the karma is still there. You're going to jail and you're suffering, isn't it? Once you wake up from the dream state back to the waker state, who's the murderer? Who's the murdered? Where is the karma? It doesn't exist. Because it was all just the dreamer, right? It was consciousness taking the form of the dreamer, right? Like the web of the spiders coming out of the spider, right? And withdrawing it within it. So in that sense, from the highest point of view, right? Obviously we don't live at that level, right? But theoretically, according to the rishis, right? this is how you get liberated, because it's you no longer are identifying with the doer. That's the secret. It's the drishti, right? It's the sakshi, right? The witness, right? It's that I am, right? Aham, or aham brahmasmi, right? I am Brahman, right? Yeah? So that's how you get off. So the karmic burden, good or bad, only exists when you still identify with the ego, the ahankara, right? You still think of yourself as the body, the mind, it's white. Until and unless that time goes, then yes, we are held to good or bad karma in the meantime. Right? That's the only way to freedom. And that's what they all say. Ramana says that, Ramakrishna, they all say that. When I read the Karika, the Gautamada's Karika, it was just like, it's really hard reading, right? But when you read it, you're like, oh my God, this is great. You know, then it's like, aha, it clicked. You know?
Can that be also the state though? You can use that as a spiritual state to escape the consequences of that.
Well, you won't, because you're still here. Like, until you, if you're an enlightened being, they say, then you're not held to those things, because this is why Krishna, in the story, does lots of mischievous things, right? And it's controversial. People are looking at it as like, oh, he's telling him to do this, lying about killing the elephant, Ashwatthama, hitting Duryodhana on the thigh beneath the belt, breaking the rules, doing all kinds of bad, darned things. Why isn't Krishna held to those standards, right? Because he's doing it through a different lens of understanding.
Yeah.
Right? So you could, I think, misuse or abuse that thought process.
That's the ego doing that.
Right. But from that highest vision, right, then we're not
At that level of reality, it makes sense to view the world as a universe that's deterministic, and you dissolve the boundaries of consciousness. Then, there's no doer. You didn't do that action.
And that's the key. And then we'll get into Karma Yoga, chapter 3, and it says, like, how do you do, it's actionless action, right? It even says that in the Tao Te Ching. How do you do that? Well, it's because you're not identifying with the instruments of activity as the doer. Like, they're the doer, the highest I, right, is not doing.
And yet, I feel like you still need certain codes and principles to live by for society to flourish.
Absolutely.
I think that way of thinking allows us sort of flexibility or rigid rules, but if everybody thought that way, then the situation would chaos.
Yeah, no. You wouldn't use it to justify.
It's tricky. You have to be very skillful in how you
right.
approach that.
No, absolutely.
Skillful means.
Yeah. All right. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. Any last minute comments? Okay. So to quickly just do closing prayers, if that's all right. And you guys can keep the chariot paper up and up. Everyone can return all any books or the folders when we're done. Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamidachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhiraha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschit Bhagavad Bhavet Om Asasoma Sadgamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you everyone for coming. Please take chai, please take halwa. I'm going to get fat if I keep eating all the leftovers or fatter. I do have flyers out there. Like I said, I am having some yoga studios. One is Satya Yoga and the other one is Anahata. Satya Yoga is in July, Anahata is next week. We're playing the Mahabharata movie, the Peter Brooks Mahabharata movie. It's a long movie. We're taking 4 hours of it, so it takes us the backstory all the way up to the war. So we'd love to have you guys if you want to learn more and kind of learn the backstory in the most painless way possible.
Yeah.
It's next Saturday. I have flyers out next to the food out there.